Hello, welcome to our discussion of state building and state capacity. So state building and state capacity is a very contentious topic, and it's something that is really important in understanding current international relations and as well politics within several states. So let's jump right in here. So here is a map put together by a nonprofit organization called the Fund for Peace, and this is the Fragile State Index. And basically what we have here is the ranking of state capacity according to the Fund for Peace of each state in the world. And you can see that they rate them from sustainable to alert. And so these blue and green states, you can see most of Europe, North America, the cone of South America, Oceania, right? These are considered sustainable states. They would have high state capacity. And these red states, yellow and oranges, these have lower state capacity. They are considered less sustainable. Sustainable state capacity, these are pretty much synonyms. Well, what do we mean by this? Essentially, this ties back to our concepts of internal and external sovereignty. State capacity is the state's ability to do stuff. In other words, its ability to have internal sovereignty. When the state makes a law, it actually can compel the people to follow that law. And external sovereignty, the state is able to defend its borders, to secure its borders. And so where states have really high sustainability, or where states have high state capacity, they have high internal and external sovereignty. And what that means is that they have secured borders, they have rule of law, they have high levels of public goods, right? They're able to provide things like great infrastructure, like powerful, useful education systems, right? And generally they have a high standard of living. And with lots of services provided by the state. So life in sustainable states, life in places where state capacity is high can be quite good because you have safety, you have security, you have order, you have the knowledge that if you follow the laws, the state will leave you alone. You have the knowledge that other people, if they break the law, that the state will punish them. If they trespass against you, if they hurt you, they will be punished by the state. It's a pretty good deal. This is where the state is working well. Where we have very, very low state capacity, or little to no state capacity, we would call this a failed state. And failed states are essentially states that are not able to do what a state does. And what does a state do? Well, it's sovereign. It's the ultimate authority. It makes laws and enforces those laws. It has borders. It protects those borders, et cetera, et cetera. And so failed states have very low to maybe even no internal and external sovereignty. So meaning they have low internal sovereignty, they cannot really make laws, they have low external sovereignty, they can't really secure their borders, right? They might have large parts of their country that are lawless. You might hear the term safe haven when we talk about terrorism and stuff. These are places where the state is essentially unable to govern because of very low sovereignty. And that means that lawlessness prevails and that mobs and terrorist organizations prevail. And here you see from the magazine Foreign Policy, they do an annual state capacity special, and the places where they're talking about failed states, they call it postcards from hell. And you can see this is life in failed states are places where the state is unable to provide for the public. There's no public goods and there's no protection. And this gets us much closer to what Hobbes called the state of nature, right? Where life is nasty, brutish, and short. So state capacity is an important thing to understand because we have high state capacity. We can go back to our pictures here, right? We have a much happier, healthier life than you would have in a failed state where the state is not providing things. Now, most states in the world fall somewhere in between. Most states in the world are sustainable states with sort of medium to medium high state capacity, but they also face significant challenges. And so another way to think of this is that these states are really sovereign, but they do face real challenges to their internal and external sovereignty. So for this, consider Mexico, which we saw had sort of medium levels of sustainability according to the Fund for Peace, so sort of a medium level of state capacity. Well, here we have a map of Mexico's drug cartels, right? And we can see that a lot of the country is really taken up by drug cartels. This would be very low internal sovereignty, and of course, to the extent that they are going right across the borders here of Mexico, that's an indicator of low external sovereignty as well. Well, this is standard. I mean, I think Mexico has perhaps even greater challenges, but even here in the United States, we certainly have parts of the country that the government is less able to control crime, to control goings on. We certainly have our own challenges to external sovereignty. Um, this is pretty standard throughout the world. There are, if you go back to the Fund for Peace map, you can see like Scandinavia, there are a few countries that it seems like they have really, really, really high state capacity, but by and large, most of the world is somewhere in between. They're not failed states, they're not perfect, sustainable states, it's somewhere in between. This often comes with challenges to legitimacy, right? Remember, legitimacy is the idea that those who are in power, those who are wielding power, should. They are rightly able to do so. And a lot of the times, this low legitimacy causes big problems with sovereignty. Remember, sovereignty is the monopoly on the legitimate use of force, while where you have a feeling like the state is not the legitimate actor, then you start having low sovereignty and people start acting out, disregarding your laws and disregarding your borders. And so legitimacy is a really key thing to understand when it comes to where is their high state capacity and where is their low state capacity. So some of the big challenges that a lot of places face today, displaced people. So large groups of people, think like refugee or migrant crisis. This can cause huge disruption and can cause state capacity to go down. Corruption issues, right? This clearly, where there's corruption in government, this clearly lowers the legitimacy and lowers the likelihood that people are going to obey the laws, internal sovereignty, crime, etc. And so we see that state capacity is a really important variable for understanding a lot in terms of the quality of life and sustainability of a given state. The concept of state building is that where there are failed states, that external actors can come in and help increase the state capacity, help build those institutions. Here's a map of Iraq, and of course this is a country that the United States has worked to engage in state building. The idea of the Iraq War back in the early 2000s was to take out sort of a madman dictator who was potentially dangerous because of developing weapons of mass destruction. Of course, that turned out to not be the case, at least at that time. But then the other justification was, well, if we build sort of a strong democracy in the center of the Middle East, that will create a lot of peace and prosperity for that region and for the rest of the world. Well, of course, it didn't quite go that way. And indeed, state building is tough. So the European experience of state building was that long process that we've talked about, where the big fish are eating the little fish, but it was a long and exceptionally violent process. Europe was basically at war for hundreds of years before World War II, and that was always creating ever stronger states because you had to be really strong to survive. Sometimes we look at modern Europe today and it almost seems like, oh yeah, the sovereign, strong state with high state capacity, it's just the natural way it is. That's what we're used to in a lot of the world. Well, in other parts of the world, that's not the case. And indeed, particularly in post-colonial circumstances, and a lot of this might have to do with how the borders were drawn by colonial powers, there can be very low state capacity. And so we see that being a former colony can create major barriers for state capacity. So externally building state institutions often fails, and I think that might have something to do with that legitimacy idea that we've talked about already, right? If legitimacy is so key to sovereignty, which is so key to state capacity, external actors, foreigners coming in and trying to build institutions, that can be a very tough sell for legitimacy in terms of how the people living in that place view these externally imposed rules and institutions. And so you can see how that would be difficult. And of course, you often get into the case where there are lots of different conflicting parties. You have lots of this. So for example, Iraq, a place with Sunni, with Shia, with Kurds. So we have different nations grouped in a similar political boundary. All sorts of issues arise. And so we have barely scratched the surface of this exceptionally complex topic. That's sort of going to be a theme when we're in the 101 level. We're going to just kind of look at some super complex issues. But I wanted to bring this up because the idea of building state capacity externally, our state building, right, is something that is in the news a lot. It's something that the United States has been active in, sometimes very successfully, like in Japan and Germany after World War II, sometimes quite unsuccessfully, like in Iraq and Afghanistan in the past 20 years. And of course, it's something that we often have to consider when there are international crises. So now you have the vocabulary to go out into the world and to think about these issues like a political scientist. Have a great day. I will see you next time.